So now we're going to talk a little bit of LSU football here. And at least in my opinion, LSU is one of the most intriguing programs in the entire country. I constantly have myself, going back and forth with it. One, because I think I am a huge Garrett Nussmeier fan, and he shows flashes of such elite talent. But then at the same time, he's also so inconsistent too, with having 12 interceptions, the most in the country, aside from Carson Beck. And, now we go into what's going to be his senior year. They brought in a number of guys in the transfer portal, another top 10 class. So Preston, what are your thoughts on LSU and exactly, what their expectations should be this year?
I think LSU. So first of all, the thing you have to know about LSU is before they hired Brian Kelly, each of their last three coaches have won a national championship. Nick Saban, Les Miles, Ed Orgeron. Yeah. So obviously Brian Kelly, he had a ton of success at Notre Dame. I thought it was a great hire at the time. I'm like, if Ed Orgeron can win a championship, Brian Kelly can definitely win a national championship. I will say this though, he's 29-11 at LSU. He has 17 SEC wins. That's third behind Alabama and Georgia in that time. But I feel like he's really wasted a lot of elite talent with really bad defenses. He had a Heisman Trophy winner in Jaden Daniels. He also had Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. And they didn't live up to their expectations because their defense was so bad. Then you go out, last year, and you get the defensive coordinator from Missouri, Blake Baker, and you make him the highest paid defensive assistant at the time, or the highest paid assistant. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And last year you ranked 61st in total defense, 51st in rush defense, and 59th in scoring defense. You're LSU, you can get the best players in the country, basically from you have a lockdown, one of the best recruiting grounds in the country on lock in the state of Louisiana. And you can't do better than 51st in any defensive category. To me, that's unacceptable. You're LSU. So I feel like Brian Kelly has really wasted a bunch of offensive talent that they could have used to make a deep playoff run with really bad defenses. And right, you said Garrett Nussmeier, he needs to take the next step. He has elite level talent. I know people that say he might be the first overall pick in next year's NFL draft.
I don't know about that.
I'm serious, because he has that level of talent. He's just very inconsistent. He makes some throws that make you go, wow, this dude is a fucking baller. Right. And he makes some other throws where you're like, the fuck are you doing? Why would you throw that? Why? He just is very questionable decision-making at times, which as a coach just makes you rip your hair out. And then I think Brian Kelly is also under a lot of pressure for this reason. Notre Dame did make the national championship game last year. And he left Notre Dame because he said, I've hit my ceiling here. I can't be more successful than I already have been. Notre Dame almost won the national championship last year with Marcus Freeman. So I think Brian Kelly is under a lot of pressure. He needs to get this defense right. They need to fix that defense, and they return 65% of their offensive production. Their defense returns 59% of their production. Now, if they're not a great defense, then you're like, maybe that's kind of a good thing, that they don't have a lot of production coming back. I don't know. I also think you've really squandered Harold Perkins. Harold Perkins was, I think, a top 10 recruit in the country. This outside linebacker, just elite level pass rusher. He had a phenomenal freshman year. And then they put him in the middle. They moved him to middle linebacker, and he hasn't had that level of production. It kind of reminds me of a few years ago under Jimbo Fisher when Florida State had this great pass rusher in Matthew Thomas, and they just put him at middle linebacker, and he wasn't productive at all. So I don't know, you have a freak athlete that can just wreak havoc on the edge, but you're willingly choosing to self-handicap yourself by putting him in the middle where it's more instinctual and where you have to really understand the flow of the game. Whereas on the edge, you can just wreak havoc. So I don't know. I'm not in practices, obviously, but I feel like Brian Kelly is under a lot of pressure. I don't think they're going to fire him. I think their buyout, I think his buyout is too big. But I do think LSU needs to at least make a playoff appearance next year. I think it's that level of pressure.
Exactly, too, because I remember going back and listening to that press conference about him pretty much saying, hey, I don't think he pretty much, exactly what you said. Hey, I don't think I can win a national title at Notre Dame too.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my criticism of Brian Kelly, you mentioned the defense. You mentioned all the elite players that he has essentially had and not gone any further than not getting where he needs to be. But I'd say
he won the SEC West 1 year, like in his first year. That's the furthest he's been. Like that's the best season they've had.
Exactly. You brought up a good point there too. My other criticism of him too, I don't think I think he has done a little bit too much of kind of copy and pasting the way he recruited and the way he sold the program at Notre Dame compared to LSU. Because, people who are Notre Dame fans, you're selling the tradition, you're selling the culture, you're selling the history. And in LSU, you're selling the passion, you're selling the victories and the past national championships too. And I think there has been a little bit of, not recruiting in Louisiana as much. I think he's kind of been trying to recruit a little bit outside of the pipelines too. And it's worth mentioning too, LSU this year has 8 players rated in the top 100 per 24/7 Sports too. So it's not like they're not getting elite players in there. They have Kalen Lacey, the wide receiver, coming back again, who I think is even going to be a bigger source of production for him too. But even when I go back and think about LSU's offense is another thing you brought up too. The one thing that was missing, aside from the inconsistency from Nussmeier, which by the way made me think about that really sweet pass versus Ole Miss in the red zone for that touchdown, where he just put it right in the breadbasket for him. That's another example of him being an elite guy. But I think what they're missing really from their offense last year, aside from the rushing attack was abysmal. But really, they lacked a downfield vertical passing attack. I think that's really what's kind of missing. And yes, when you bring in a guy like Mike Dunbrock, for example,
you had Will Campbell at left tackle. He's going to be the first left tackle off the board in this NFL draft. Like, you've had great offensive lines around both Garrett Nussmeier and Jane Daniels, and you've squandered it with really bad defenses. Your defenses have been abysmal by LSU standards. So, and it's not like you said, it's not like they don't have elite level talent. It's LSU. They're going to get a top 10, if not a top 5 recruiting class every single year just by locking down the state of Louisiana. Louisiana is one of the most talent-rich states in the country. And you're the flagship program in that state. You have elite level talent, and you haven't done enough with it. And I feel like you've really kind of squandered it. Like, it's kind of like, this is kind of how I feel about Lincoln Riley and USC. Like, you had Caleb Williams, you've had Baker Mayfield, you've had Kyler Murray, you've had all these Heisman winning quarterbacks, but you haven't done anything with them. Like, yeah, you make the playoff, but you don't win playoff games. You've never won a playoff game with any of those first-round number 1 overall pick quarterbacks. I feel like Brian Kelly is starting to kind of get into that mold where you have all this talent, but you're not maximizing your windows with that talent. Does that make sense?
Exactly, too. And, I go back and think to myself, too, I think they gave him, I think it was like $95 million or something. It wasn't exactly $100 million, but it was just a little bit shy of that, too. And, now that I'm thinking about kind of the comparison between 24 and 25 now, they lost 4 starting offensive linemen, too. So they're going to be relying on a lot of young starters, too, that you're going to have to plug in, kind of hope for the best. And then you have a number of transfer receivers, too. You have Nick Anderson from Oklahoma. You have Baron Brown at Kentucky, who I think can kind of be their equivalent of that deep vertical threat that I kind of talked about a little bit ago too. And then Aaron Anderson's probably going to be the other guy aside from Lacey, who had 880 yards last year too. Mm-hmm. And again, I think Brian Kelly's is one of those guys where you sort of love to hate him too, in the sense that some of his antics on the sidelines always kind of cracks me up, especially during that Florida game last year. But at the same time too, LSU's kind of stuck with them too, because they spent all this money on him, and they're only going to continue spending more money with $26 million in terms of NIL money. We don't know in terms of how it's divvied up between all the sports. We just know it's that much money. But especially too, it just goes to think too, you've had so many opportunities on a silver platter, and it's only a matter of time before fans are going to start getting fed up with it too. Because even as I look at their schedule, some of the highlights that I have here, I mean, you have Florida on September 13th, and then what I think the other big game is going to be is November 8th at Alabama. To me, that's going to be the game where I think both Alabama and LSU are going to be kind of in that situation where, hey, if they have one more loss, you can kiss any sort of SEC championship game goodbye, and you're going to have to rely on getting to a playoff bid at large.
That game could very well, because it typically does. That game typically does determine the winner of the SEC West. So, but now that we're gone with divisions, we'll see. But yeah, that's always been a huge game, and you said it's at Bryant-Denny, it's at Alabama.
At Alabama, that's right.
They typically struggle there, so we'll see.
Yeah, and especially too, I didn't even bring this up, but their opener is against Clemson too. I completely glossed over that whole part that they're going to be facing that too. And for anyone who's watched this program enough, I'm a huge Dabo Swinney guy. I don't think I'm ever going to say a bad thing about him. But especially too, LSU has lost. I'm pretty sure they've lost their last four openers. I don't think they've won a single opening game with Brian Kelly, because I remember last year they lost the barn.
They lost to USC.
Yeah,
they lost to USC. Yeah. Yeah, no, and Clemson, not talked about return production. Clemson, I think, is the number one team in terms of returning production. Like, they didn't lose anybody of note. And they have another returning quarterback in Cade Klubnik, so that's not going to be easy. I mean, right now, I'd probably pick Clemson to win that game. I know it's really early, but, I mean, I think Dabo Swinney has proven to be a better coach than Brian Kelly. So, I mean, I don't know. I think this year is a huge year for LSU and for Brian Kelly. They need to maximize their window, because they haven't been able to do that in the past.
Yeah, and I always think to myself too, like, Death Valley is one of the hardest places in the entire country to play. And it's not that they're not taking advantage of it. You just kind of sit there and say to yourself, LSU fans just aren't going to sit there and tolerate not being anywhere near a national championship picture for another 4 or 5 seasons. Something just isn't really clicking there, but I'm definitely kind of intrigued to see, will their aggressiveness in the portal and, bringing in these guys and having Nussmeier for a senior year, will it kind of translate to a national championship? So I guess we'll see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm really excited. I definitely want to see if Garrett Nussmeier can take that next step, with a rebuilt and a completely new offensive line. So I think that'll be really interesting.